Hello and welcome to Mapping the Master Plan. I'm Tom Bott. I'm the town planner here in Kingston, Mass. Thank you for watching today and our continuing series of shows about the Master Plan. The Kingston Master Plan, originally created in 1970, did an update in 1998, and now we're working on our 2015 plan. With me today in the studio is Ted Brovitz of Brovitz Design, Community Design, who is our lead consultant on the master plan, and today we're going to talk a little about land use. So thanks for coming, Ted.
Thanks, Tom. Glad to be here again.
So as we've talked about, internally at least, and we don't talk about it, we're not always on camera when we're talking about things. Land use is one of the 8 elements of the master plan that includes economic development, transportation, open space, housing, amongst those. And elements or chapters in the land use in the master plan. But the land use is sort of the spine where things sort of connect to. And in it we talk about population, we talk about, well actually let me just turn it over to you and talk about what we're actually talking about in our land use plan.
Sure. Well, you just said it. Basically, the land use is really what brings everything together. If you think about how communities function, it's really about, development and conservation areas and adding to that municipal facilities and services. So, the way we're approaching the master plan here is to really get a good handle on what's there today, what the trends and conditions are in terms of land use, development patterns, areas of similar characteristics, how we break down distinctions between our commercial areas and our industrial areas and our residential areas and our conservation areas. And basically sort of tie that all together into an overall vision based on community input that the other elements of the plan will feed into. So housing is a big part of land use, particularly in more suburban communities, and it's a big part in Kingston. So what people's vision is in terms of residential development in neighborhoods and different types of housing uses, that'll feed into an overall land use plan. As will the transportation, as will economic development, commercial, industrial activities, so on and so forth. So, the first step is really understanding our land use patterns, and then sort of considering through our public initiation involvement process what the community wants to see over the next 20 years in Kingston, and then feeding in all the pieces to the overall plan.
And it's not just what the committee wants to see. The committee is the sort of the board of directors for the master plan. All this stuff is very reliant on public input. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons that we're having our shows are to talk about the master plan and to generate some additional interest for people to participate, whether they come to one of the forums and meetings that we have, or whether they just want to send something or comments or things like that. As we talked about before, and Ted is going to be having office hours in Town Hall, in addition to our various public meetings. So whether you've got input about some idea about something, you can certainly send it to me, to my email address, to tbott@kingstonmass.org, and we'll forward it on to Ted. We also have a Facebook page. We're working on a website. One of our open space committee members who's on the master plan, Matt Capizio, has done a fabulous job putting together the framework for a website that will be, or we're not quite live on the website.
Not quite yet, but shortly.
But we're getting onto that. Yeah. So in the land use chapter from the '98 plan, very broad sort of things, and this is how the master plan starts. There are goals, and there are policies, and there are actions. So the goal in the 1998 master plan for land use is to plan residential and commercial growth with the desired objective of protecting the small town character of Kingston. And so they talk about policies to protect residential, historic, and natural resource areas, much like the show we were talking about with Gary Langenbach and Maureen Thomas on our open space and natural resource, protecting those natural resource areas and trying to steer development to the places that are appropriate for it, because change is going to happen, development is going to come. It's just sort of a matter of having some policies and hopefully some incentives in place to steer that growth to those areas. Other policies in managing growth, including its impact on services, and infrastructure, and we touched a little bit of that in another show about potential expansion of Saxon Properties, who has Colony Place, looking at potentially trying to expand into Kingston. What's that impact of additional commercial use or residential use in an area like that? So with that, we have a snapshot of what we have currently existing. And we get that information through some of the assessors' databases. When the assessors value a piece of land, they put a code on it that says this land's used for residential use or this land's used for commercial use. And so we're building off of that sort of information as others.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of information out there. Obviously, the town assessor's information is really important. The town has a Geographic Information System, or GIS, which is a mapping tool that's connected to the property record. So we've gone through all the land use information we can gather, both from the town as well as from the Regional Planning Commission and from the state, to get a sort of a snapshot of where we are today. And we're looking at it in terms of areas with similar characteristics. So, you can say we've got about 238 acres of commercially zoned property in town, or used property in town. We've got about 120 acres of industrially used property in town. But if you look more closely at the composition of different types of uses, they're very different from each other. So for example, our commercial district on 3A is more highway, strip-oriented type commercial use versus what you see today at the mall, the Kingston Collection, or what you might see in downtown. Very different development patterns. So we need to understand that as well, so that as we plan, specifically for our corridors and our centers and our special districts, like the area around the train station and the mall, we understand what the real opportunities and constraints are, and have the publicly driven process of redefining those areas over the next 20 years. So if we're talking about downtown, for example, what we've heard so far is that people want it to be a vibrant gathering place, mixed use with a combination of commercial, residential, and civic, public-oriented type uses. Better, sort of streetscape, or vital type streets where there's maybe outdoor dining here and there, pocket parks, areas for people to gather. And then, other, sort of things like, restaurants and shops and other services, so that it's not only a place of gathering, but it's a place of necessity for the community. That's different than, what we have at the mall, which is a large collection of primarily, large format retailers and franchise
and privately
retailers.
owned, as opposed to.
And privately owned, right. So, that obviously the Kingston Collection has been going through a transition over the number of years. There's a lot of new competition that there wasn't back in 1998, when it was the largest tax revenue source in town, and it was the largest employer. So we need to think about what that transition means for the community, and what opportunities might be there in addition to the retail elements that have existed for the last 20 years. And then along the corridors, the commercial corridors, obviously there's areas that may provide opportunities for more infill development, certainly better streetscape improvements.
I should mention the jargon bell. In the event that any of us get too jargony, we have the jargon bell here. So infill development is?
Infill development is taking the opportunity to put new buildings in spaces that are underutilized. So if you look at a lot of commercial corridors, there tends to be more parking than is actually needed. And that's one of the things we're going to try to understand and discuss with the public is, are there places, whether it's the Kingston Mall, whether it's different parts of 3A, where we have an excess of parking that could be otherwise used for new buildings, whether they're commercial buildings or mixed use, being residential and commercial. We want to take advantage of those opportunities, because that adds more life to the community, but it also adds a better tax base to the community. So these are the things we're looking at right now, is sort of what the development patterns are today, what opportunities and constraints each of these different areas have, and then sharing that information with the public, so that they can sort of give us an idea, where they want to go for the next 20 years. And it's not just about commercial and industrial land, it's also about residential land use patterns and more rural and open space type development patterns. I mean, there's a large percentage of our, almost 50% of our land in Kingston is forest land. We've got about 400 acres of cranberry bogs. So that's an important part of the overall land use picture in the community. It's very important to the average citizen that open space is protected and conserved and provides opportunities for passive and active recreation. Don't ring me again.
No,
I can explain passive and active. Active would be like a sporting event, a soccer field you'd put into certain open space, and passive might be trails and sort of hiking areas and that sort of stuff.
And we actually covered some of this stuff in our open space and natural resource show. So folks who want to watch back-to-back episodes, you can see both of those. When I was in Atlanta working for Marietta, we also had a future land use map. And we don't really have a future land use map in our current plan. Is that something that you would typically see in a contemporary master plan?
Certainly in the South, where you're from.
Because
it's not something you see so much in the Northeast, but it's something that we're going to do for this plan because it's a very important tool in planning for the future. And we are doing the Kingston Placemaking Summit, and ultimately the goal there is to come up with a future land use plan which would be enhanced by conceptual visions of different areas of the community, whether they're commercial areas, whether they're the downtown area, whether they're rural residential, even little neighborhood centers. I mean, the idea is to give people a better sense and vision of what the community wants to see.
And that gets back to sort of trying to steer development to the appropriate areas.
Right. And protecting other areas. And that's how these other parts, these other chapters or elements of the plan feed into the land use plan, which is really, like you say, the future land use plan. So, what do we do with housing? What are the priorities and goals for housing? What does that mean in terms of land use in the future? Economic development, your commercial, industrial, mixed use opportunities. What does that mean in terms of on the ground changes and enhancements? Transportation, how do we get from here to there? And are we going by car, by train, or by bike, or on foot? So all these things feed into the overall land use plan, or the future land use plan for Kingston.
And one of the other things we would expect to see, that you would typically see from a master plan effort, is after the plan itself is complete as a document, and looking at implementing putting into action those things identified in the plan. And that would typically include a review of local zoning and local subdivision regulations. Zoning says where things go at. Subdivision regulations talk about how you go about building those in residential areas and in industrial areas as well. So I would venture to say that we expect to see, as a byproduct, I'm not trying to stack the deck for the master plan, but I would venture to say we expect to see a review of both the zoning regulations and subdivision regulations as a product of the master plan.
Yeah, that's correct. And not only an evaluation of what we have in terms of the zoning ordinance and subdivision regulations, and even the design guidelines for the smart growth districts, Chapter 40R districts, but also looking at what's there today on the ground. So we can take the assessor's records, the local property records, and we can determine what the floor area ratios, what the density is, what the average lot size is, so that we know how well the current development patterns are matching what's required by the zoning regulations in terms of the uses as well as the dimensional standards.
Right. What's the floor area ratio?
A floor area ratio is a ratio of the building coverage over the lot. So you may have a floor area ratio of 1, which means you could have a 1-story building covering the entire lot. If you were to make that 2 stories, it would cover half the lot. But other more simple dimensional standards would be minimum lot size. What are the minimum lot size in the different residential, commercial, industrial districts? And how does that match up to what's there in the ground today? Are we asking for too much land? Are we asking for too much frontage? Are we asking for too much open space allocation on site based on the models that we have today? And not only, what's there today, but what are the good models we have? What do people really like in the different zoning districts in terms of developments and buildings? And how does that fit the current regulations? And if it doesn't, then that combined with the overall land use plan, the people's vision, would be the foundation for making changes to the regulations so it better fits the overall vision that people have for Kingston.
Yeah, and we talked a little earlier about parking, in that we have parking regulations that were created in an earlier time. Our zoning bylaw is 1992. And for the most part, most of us, professional planners, look at and believe that there's just too much parking for most of the uses. Too much parking takes up space that you could have for a store or for another use. It also creates stormwater issues, where when the water hits the pavement, it has to go somewhere, and we have to treat it before it just gets percolated into the ground or discharged into a stream or something like that. Also, some of the stuff we were talking about during the open space and natural resources program. So we'll look at parking. We had a big conversation about this at the planning board meeting the other night about a new restaurant that wants to come into the town center, which is fabulous, which is right up one of those things that we've been talking about in the master plan meetings, about emphasis on having a very inviting town center. So this new restaurant has that potential. We look around and go, well, under our current standards, where are these people going to park at? So once again, that review of looking at how we're currently doing business and how we should be doing business would be an outcome of the land use element.
Yeah, and parking is part of the zoning requirements. And parking, more than anything else, is the driving factor in how development gets done, because the standards are generally very high in suburban communities, and Kingston is one of those communities where the standards are very high. And a lot of communities these days are taking a really hard look at how much parking is really needed, and evaluating the actual occupation of parking during peak times of the day, and getting a much better understanding of what's really necessary and what lost opportunities are there to do other things with this property to generate more vitality as well as the tax base. So that's certainly a big part of the evaluation from zoning, being that parking is such an important consideration in site plan. And a lot of towns are putting together very progressive new parking standards. So, they may have a pretty rigid requirement, or a pretty high requirement, you might think, in terms of the ratio of the number of spaces to the square footage of the building. But they'll put together a toolbox which will allow you to reduce the on-site parking if you can demonstrate that you don't need that much, or if you can make arrangements with your neighbors to share parking when their peak hour use is different from yours, or if you're within a number of comfortable walking distance to public parking that's available, that you can discount the number of spaces on site. There's a lot of different ways that communities are being more flexible about meeting the parking demand without having so much space on site allocated to parking, and sharing a resource in a given district between property owners and between the town and property owners, so that we don't waste space that could otherwise be used for buildings or streetscape improvements, better sidewalks, or little pocket parks, or a number of other things other than parking that really isn't necessary.
Yeah, one of the things we added since the 1992 bylaw is a provision that allows someone to share parking if it's within 300 feet of your property, provided it's not across a busy road. So in this case of the town center district, you can share parking on either side of the street. And though people walk across Main Street, the requirement is not under an arterial parking area. Arterial is a type of road. You can ring the bell if you like.
Can I ring the bell?
Yeah, that has, you probably do. You've been waiting. But so that is sort of included in our zoning bylaw, but it gets back to taking that step back and looking at the whole zoning bylaw and how the parts that we add you don't always get all those parts integrated into the zoning bylaws. So I don't want to get too far in front of us to say, yes, we're definitely going to redo our zoning bylaw. But we hear a lot of that from folks in the economic development side of things, from the preservation side of things as well, in looking at better ways to use the land that we have. Because as Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain said, buy land, they're not making it anymore.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a parking requirement that says that you can't cross a street to get from, you can't use parking on this side to get to that side. I mean,
welcome to Kingston. It was my verbiage.
I mean, most downtowns that have those provisions, that's a common provision these days, is that yes, you can utilize public parking, or you can have an auxiliary lot, satellite lot, if you have a shared parking agreement, as long as it's within a certain walking distance. Now, we have crosswalks, I would imagine, in our downtown areas, like most downtowns do.
There is one.
I mean, what we want to do is encourage people, particularly in downtown, to park one place and do a number of things. Park once is basically the philosophy, so that we don't want them crossing the street in their cars to get to the other side for another. If they're picking up a dry cleaning, going to a restaurant, going to another shop, what have you, we'd like them to do all that within one trip.
Can we say that's called chaining your trip?
That's linking your trips,
yeah.
I mean, so because that just creates more traffic and congestion, and really isn't necessary. So those are the things that, we're going to be looking carefully at in the zoning, and providing very specific recommendations on things that should be considered in terms of amendments.
So, and in the land use element, we can expect to see lots of maps.
You'll see lots of maps. Unlike the 1998 plan, this will be a very visual plan. I think it's really important, and our whole team is, emphasizing, visualization of what Kingston's going to be in the next 20 years. So that'll be a really important part. Not only, maps, plans, sort of plan view type plans,
plan view
concepts, looking from up down, but also, cross sections, where you see if you were standing on the street and what things might look like. We'll also have some case studies from similar type communities, or communities that people think that are relevant to Kingston, and there are things we can learn from them, and we'll provide some examples like that, case studies. We're also going to do a visual preference survey as part of our placemaking summit, where we show people a variety of different images of different building types, development patterns, landscapes, open spaces, so on, and people can rate those images in terms of how much they like them and how relevant they are to Kingston.
Do you like this one better than this one?
That's right.
Visual preference.
Right. So it's a preference of building and open space and street improvement type elements. So it'll be a very visual plan for sure.
And while we talk off camera prior to getting here, while we're doing a show on each section of the master plan, chances are we're going to do a second show on the land use plan following the design charrette, and maybe share some of those ideas and things that came out of that weekend design charrette that we've got coming up. Land use, everything connects to land use. That's why it's one of the first sections in the master plan, and there's a lot of work product that comes out of that after the fact.
Right.
And looking at reviewing those sort of things. But in the interim, to get us to that point, lots of maps, lots of pictures, text, but text is necessary because picture can tell a lot.
Well, we're going to try to minimize the text as much and keep it, simple paragraphs, and supplement that with a lot of graphics, that'll show, basic statistics and trends without having to write them all out. I think it makes things easier for people to follow, and the writing will be sort of more on the implementation side of things. We'll have very specific recommendations on things that need to get done in order to fulfill the plan. Land use is up front in terms of understanding the current uses and development patterns and our different areas of different characteristics. But that all goes up and funnels into the future land use plan and related graphics and concepts and that sort of thing.
So as we work on the master plan, please feel free to send your ideas in. Please come to the meetings. All our meetings are public. All our meetings are posted. If you've got ideas and you can't make it to a meeting, you can send the information to me at tbott@kingstonmass.org. You can post things to our Facebook page as well. And we'll be posting Ted's office hours, because he'll be holding office hours in the town hall on our town website as well. So we'll hopefully get that ironed out here in the next few days, so we'll have those hours up there. So thank you very much to Ted for being here today. And we hope to see you at some of our meetings, and please don't be shy about sending us ideas about things to include in the master plan, whether it's at some of the public meetings or just sending me an email or stopping by my office. If it's written on a cocktail napkin, whatever it is, if it's written down, it's a lot easier for us to capture than just trying to remember what it is that you had to say. So Ted, once again, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you, Tom.
And thank you folks for tuning in as well.